Hello, everybody. We are live for another Unapologetically Bold. I'm not sorry for. And I am so blessed today to have Dave with me. Dave is somebody that I met through Sandy, LinkedIn, like so
Yep.
many cool people that I know. So I am blessed to have you on today. So, with that, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I'm really excited to be here. I'm glad that Sandy connected us. It's always fun to see how one connection leads to different things down the line. So I'm grateful for the chance to be here. I run a small consulting company called Evolve Leadership Consulting. I've done that work now since 2014, so 6 years. And I typically work with small to mid-sized companies, and mostly what we focus on is what I call kind of the villain of misalignment. And so we look at kind of four elements of any business. And what we often see is that, strategy, culture, story, and execution are kind of the four buckets. And that at any one time, those things can be kind of moving in different directions. And that often leads to the stressed out feeling, that leads to the I can't sleep. My wife became a therapist, or my spouse became a therapist because I, am stressed out at work. And so we really realign those systems. And in realignment, kind of regain and help people kind of reclaim their joy for their work and increase revenue.
I love it.
People care about, right? Yeah.
And I think too, it's going to lead into what you're not sorry for. And before we get into that, I do want to ask people to continue to like, subscribe, and share, as our goal is to bring positivity to your listening ears. And as we continue on this mission of humanity and sparking it for the betterment. So,
yeah,
let's go ahead. Dave, what are you not sorry for?
So this is something that I've grown into over the course of my life. But I'm not sorry for making things awkward. And here's really what that means is, I think in a lot of conversations that I'm in when I'm working with different companies, there's what I call kind of unspoken truces. And it's the things that don't get said that often just kind of sit there. And so, it's awkward in its own right not to talk about the things that are important. And, I often say that not dealing with our issues is what gives them power. And so my awkwardness is taking that power back, is to actually raise the thing that nobody's talking about, is to say, hey, here's what I see. What's going on with that? And that can be, really uncomfortable at times. That can create a lot of tension in a space. But I ultimately think that awkwardness and the silence that might follow that, or the courage that it takes to speak into that, even though that feels awkward, leads to just better work environments, better relationships. You mentioned spreading positivity. I think it just creates a more positive environment when we actually deal with the things that are causing us that pain. So that's the thing I'm not sorry for, is kind of asking people to step into what might feel like a really awkward, difficult conversation.
I hear so many awesome things that I want to go with that. I think the first one I hear is, it makes me think of Google's study on the Aristotle Project and psychological safety, and the ability to build relationships so that you can have those awkward conversations. So how has building that happened for you? How have you built, in essence, psychological safety, or a place where people can have these awkward questions and these awkward conversations?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. I use that study a lot. The psychological safety piece for me is really important, right? Because the reason we're not talking about it is likely because somebody doesn't feel safe, right? So there's kind of two things that I think about with that. The first is I utilize observation quite a bit, and observation without judgment. So I think a lot of folks say, well, just say what you think or say what you feel. And it's like, well, I try to remove the thinking and the feeling and just say, here's what I see, right? So like, I see that when you said this, your counterpart didn't say anything. So tell me about that. And then it's followed up with a curious question, right? So observation plus curiosity, to me, creates the safety. Because I think when you bring judgment into that space of like, hey, you're yelling, why are you yelling? It's like, well, now I just judged you. I judged that you were yelling. You might not think so. And now we're kind of tussling back and forth about whether you were yelling or not, which is kind of a waste of our time. So it's more like, hey, when you said this, I saw this. Mm-hmm. So tell me about that. What's going on there? It's like, well, I just made it safe now for us to talk about that and invite, it's an invitation into conversation.
And I love that's the word that I've been using lately is an invitation to.
Yeah,
because you're not telling somebody, you're inviting them to, and they're more likely to come into it.
Yeah.
But also with that, the power of, I think as consultants or anything, we're good on objectivity. That's the reason why people bring us in, because we're like a fair playing ground for everybody to have a conversation.
Yeah.
But not everybody's like that. So
Right.
How do you help people be more objective in the process of making it awkward? Because that may not be their natural tendency. So to be objective is awkward in that own status of itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I'm glad you said that. I mean, I think we have an advantage as outsiders looking in often because we don't have the social, kind of container that they're in, right? Like we're not carrying the social baggage. We're not carrying the hierarchy with us. Like it's easier for us to say that than for somebody who lives in that hierarchy. So often, you mentioned objectivity. And I think, again, I would just come back to that observation piece and empowering someone to say something and kind of coaching them through, like, here's how you might bring up that difficult thing. The other thing I would say, though, too, is, I think folks, like I say, kind of not dealing with the issues is what gives them power. The more time it takes for you to say something, the more powerful it gets, right? So if somebody's been, saying something in a meeting and it's oppressive to you, or it makes you feel like you can't contribute, not doing anything about it just makes that meeting worse every time you go to that meeting. And so I'll often talk about, like, what would you rather have, 5 minutes of pain or 2 years of not saying anything in a meeting and wishing that you did, right? Like, so make it awkward for 5 minutes and then your life gets better ultimately, as opposed to, so the objectivity is in some ways kind of a reframe of the mindset, right? Of like, hey, take 5 minutes of pain as opposed to 2 years of, wishing you would have said something and didn't, right?
Yeah. So tell me a story about that you learned, because what I'm thinking of is Pete Havel is coming on in a future show, and he wrote the book, The Arsonist in the Office. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. Yeah. And it's talking about basically that, but he was brought in on the aspect that he was supposed to control the arsonist and kind of be a buffer for others to not have the fire or the flames going at him or going at others. So how have you seen it power people that are in essence arsonists by not having those awkward conversations? And sometimes those people that are like that are high performers. They're extremely high performers.
Absolutely.
But they're tearing down a team. So what have you seen in your experience and then the aftermath and the power of it by addressing?
Yeah, and actually I typically try to engage both people who are involved in it, because it's always it's always two-sided, right? So I don't know if you ever, the dog whisperer, some odd years ago, Cesar Milan was the guy's name. And I was always impressed that, it was, the dog was showing the symptoms, but it was almost always the owner's fault. Right. And so, like, I often think about, okay, so there's two sides to every relationship, at least, if not more. And so, if you're working with a person that's feeling that difficulty, like I just was talking to somebody the other day who's kind of a number two in a company. So there's, the leader of the organization, they're kind of the COO basically. And, they kind of just kept mentioning, well, I can't do that because I just want to make sure I'm doing things right. I just want to make sure I'm doing things right. And so I just pointed out, like, hey, have you noticed that when I ask you, hey, why isn't this getting done? Or what's the challenge here? You keep bringing up, I just want to make sure I'm doing things right. Tell me about that. Like, where's that coming from? And so then it was like, well, then we kind of worked through it. It was like, well, I don't really know what he wants. I'm like, okay. So to me, it's often getting clear on what the actual core problem is, as opposed to the symptoms. Often the symptoms are like, well, I don't know, so I didn't say anything, or I kind of did that work over here. I felt really uncomfortable. It's like, well, those are all symptoms of, like, really what you lack is just the clarity of, like, you haven't had the conversation with the CEO around, what does this look like? Like, what does excellence look like if that's what you're dealing with? And so then it's, hey, let's connect with the CEO and figure out what's excellence. But I often refer to those things, I talk a lot about misalignment, and, we call it conflict management or the arsonist, or, like, there's all this kind of dark language around it. And I often think that's in its own kind of a hindrance to folks feeling empowered to have that conversation. Like, I don't call it conflict management, I call it misalignment. It's like, we're not lined up, we're not on the same page, so let's get on the same page. And that, to me, kind of diminishes the anxiety that comes with those conversations.
Because I think it brings in the factor of teamwork.
Exactly.
That we are all together for a cumulative better good instead of a comparative, what I've talked on the show many times about, a comparative curse, and how we compare ourselves to others. And there is this saying that don't make assumptions, because you might end up looking like the first 3 letters of the word.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happens is we make these assumptions. And I see that Nathan had a comment on here about the ability to have clear expectations. And what I've talked about also in the past is that a lot of people say communication is the issue. But for us, I think it's having those awkward conversations to get to actual clear expectations. What does it mean for you for XYZ to get done? Or what does it mean? And it's that misalignment. And I love how you phrase it out with it's a team approach, and it's more of a positive approach.
Yeah.
What got you here?
Yeah. It's interesting. I thought a pretty profound work, at least in my own understanding, was the work by Patrick Lencioni around the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And there's a couple elements that I think are really important. The trust piece, I think, is kind of foundational to he's got 5 pieces, and number 1 is trust. And I think that's really important. And one thing he talks a lot about is vulnerable trust. And vulnerable trust is saying things like, I don't know the answer to that question, what do you think? Or, hey, I messed up. Like saying sorry without attachment. And I think those things are just really powerful invitations in the conversation, and to Nathan's comment around clear expectations and talking about communication. The 2 biggest communication challenges I see around expectations that get missed are 2 things. So number 1 is what I call downward spiral conversations. And downward spiral conversations are like, well, I didn't get that done on time because my computer stopped working. And my computer stopped working because there was a lightning storm. And there was a lightning storm because of global warming. It's like, well, why are we talking about global warming? Like, you didn't get your thing done. Like, we just totally went somewhere else. And we talked about 4 problems and we didn't deal with any of them. Right? And so downward spiral conversations happen in meetings constantly. And so much of what I spend my time doing is just saying, like, hey, that's interesting, but let's pull it back and actually deal with the issue we were talking about. Which brings me to part 2, which is the kind of focus on action and results, and making sure that everybody's clear at the end of, I always say, who's doing what by when? And we end every meeting with who's doing what by when, and is everybody clear on what that is? And if we get clear on who's doing it, what they're actually doing, and when is it going to get done by, we build in the accountability, we build in the focus on results, and we kind of stop that downward spiral that takes place. And so clear expectations to me is really those 2 things. Like, are we actually solving the issues that we identified? And 2, do we have a clear plan for who's doing what by when? Every meeting, all the time. Yeah.
And that's so important, because we do a similar approach with that. And I'll say that it's accountability and action. Like, you have to have that part. I found, and it goes back to the teamwork and about coming together and having those clear expectations. And then also saying, if people didn't do their part, not going down the downward spiral, but addressing it. What do you need? How can we help you? How can we support you to make sure that next time you do get the task done? I do want to bring in this, that sometimes awkward conversations can lead to deeper relationships, in the aspect that I've seen where people are hurting at home and they don't tell anybody. Like, their wife just got diagnosed with cancer and we're going to be quiet about it. And that's okay if you want to be. But the thing is the more that you can bring that safety in so that you can have that community. Yeah. How have you seen that impact whenever people maybe hush hush on one side of work versus life instead of embracing the and in it?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, culture is obviously so important. And I think one thing I see a lot is there's a stated culture and then there's a lived culture, and that those 2 things are often really different. I was just at a car dealership the other day, getting some service on our parents' Honda Odyssey van, soccer dad kind of thing. And there were like 20 core values up on the wall. And I remember thinking, like, how do you possibly hold people to 20 core values? Like, do they even know 5 of these? You know, like, I mean, it's great. It was awesome that they had them up and they had it displayed. And like, I'm glad that was important to you, but good luck holding people accountable to that. And so I think, you know, there's needs to be some real intent, again, kind of going back to the psychological safety piece of like, who are we? What do we care about? How are we inviting that in? And one value I've seen that I think works really well for a lot of companies is take ownership, or own what you do. And that vulnerability then of like, hey, I made a mistake. That's my fault. Sorry, everybody. I'll do better next time. It's like, even just that makes it more possible for people then to have like, oh, I'm not perfect either. Oh, good. Let me tell you about my life, right? Like, I just made it safe now for us to have conversation beyond like, did you get your objectives done? And we're only, you know, robotic people in an organization. It's like, no, all of us carry our home life into everything we do. We can't, the author Parker Palmer says you can't separate soul and role. And I love that because I think it's really profound. It's like, as much as we want to put on that facade, we can only carry it for so long. And so if we don't bring ourselves into work, we just end up feeling more stressed, more frustrated, more overwhelmed. And so I think, you know, from the leadership perspective, being able to create a culture and live a culture that you can hold people accountable to actually, you know, being that culture, living that culture, plus creating those safe spaces in vulnerability is really powerful for having people bring themselves fully into a work environment.
Yes, and I think that's true. Where I first realized that is somebody who I work with now, Tangela Johnson. She did a 12 driving forces, and basically it was looking at it's a DISC assessment style, at what your adaptive style, so your style at work is versus what your natural style is. And she's like, if there's a 20-point difference, like, you're probably stressed. Yeah. And all of mine were at that time, whenever we first did it. Every one of those were. She goes, and we actually reminisced on it like last week, and she goes, you were really stressed in 2017.
Yeah. Yes, I was. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But the misalignment that came with it, that I wanted to be one place, or I felt the need to be one way at work to get things done, crafted by my environment, comparative to what my natural and my home state and what I want to be. So quickly talk about that, about bringing those together and whenever you have those collide.
Yeah, you know, and honestly, I mean, I think the like very tactile version of this is, you know, what are the roles that you're responsible for at work, and do those align with what you're good at and what you love to do or not? Mm-hmm. You know, I think a lot of us get stuck. I mean, of course, there's things at work that we just, you know, like, I don't like working through receipts and doing the accounting work, but I have to. Like, it's just a thing that needs to happen, right? But, you know, so there's some of that. But I think if largely a lot of what you feel responsible for or are asked to do at work doesn't line up with kind of what you care about, what gives you meaning, what gives you joy at work, you're going to start to feel that dissonance. And same thing in home life, right? Like, if you feel really stuck in a particularly difficult situation, or contexts or situations happen and you feel really stuck over there, it's like that dissonance, that lack of resolve carries over. It spills into everything. And so, you know, one of my favorite examples of a lack of resolve is if you sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and you don't sing the last note, right? How I wonder what you... It's like that's the lack of... Like, you're just like, well, just finish the song, right? And so I think for me, I've found that the idea of making it awkward is much more about bringing resolve. It's like the alignment feeling is what resolve feels like in most organizations. So that can be, you know, alignment can be like, hey, we actually put you in a position, literally in a position where you can be successful and you can live into what you're good at. Or it can be like, hey, let's just talk about the hard thing we haven't been talking about. Let's align culturally, let's align in strategy, let's align in execution, and let's align our story. And those are the 4 things that I think if those line up, you start to feel that resolve. And when that resolve is there, then you feel like you can actually fully be yourself.
I love that. And one thing that comes to my mind is what you talked about earlier about core values, and that they're having 20 different core values. One, how is that? The person even and the part that a lot of the time core values are they're on a wall, and that's about it. you know?
Yeah.
But with that, a lot of confrontations and awkwardness is based on our values and like how I feel strongly about things. So somebody's listening to this and they're like, oh, I need to have all these awkward conversations. How do they use their values almost as a filter instead, or what do they use? What would you recommend and invite them to use for a filter instead of just say, I'm going to talk to everybody, and then it goes fun.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said that because, core values is one of those things that I feel like pretty much every company's figured out, right? Like, oh, we should have core values. And I think there's probably 3 best practices in any company. So if I'm working with a leadership team, there's always 3 things I talk about. Number 1 is, the core values can't be what are called kind of permission to play values, which is like honesty. It's like, well, yeah, if you're not honest, you probably shouldn't be employed. Like that's just kind of basic human knowledge, right? So maybe let's not do that and keep it simple, right? So like I said, I gave the example of take ownership. So in some ways it should like call people forward. And so, 1, it should just be like things that people can understand, like make it simple. 2, there should be performance reviews that are tied, like those should be woven into your performance reviews. And 3, which is really important around the performance review piece, is values only make sense by stories. And so we can define it. We can say, well, taking ownership is X, Y, and Z. It's like, but that doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. Like no matter how you define it, people are going to interpret it differently. And so it gets legs with the stories that we tell around it. And so it's a really great opportunity to lift people up in your organization. You can say, hey, every week you can do a shout out around a particular core value. You can say, hey, Todd the other day, or Emily the other day, really she made a mistake on a project. She took ownership. She worked long hours that evening and solved the problem. That's a really good example of taking ownership. Way to go, Emily. Right. And it's like, well, now we have a definition. We start to see what that means for our company, and we start to call out the good behavior. And the people who don't get called out start to realize like, oh, well, if I want to get called out for that, maybe I need to start, taking that behavior on. So there are some ways to kind of execute, so to speak, the values and make them come alive. I think it just gives it meaning. And I think individually, you have to kind of create your own stories that tie into that company story and start to tell what those are and start to see yourself in that. And if you can't, you're probably working in the wrong place. Yeah. Maybe go somewhere else, I guess, if you can. I mean, I guess that's easier said than done, but. Yeah.
And I want to go on to that. You were talking about misalignment at work, but how can people also use this at home?
Yeah.
And for me and my kids, we make goal statements every year, and we have our values that we stick to. So we do that. We kind of, it's like our own little company, I guess you want to say.
That's great.
So how can people take this into their home life and actionable items?
Yeah. So to kind of go all the way back to one of the first things that was said, there's 2 things that we've really practiced in our home life. And I love that you do kind of a word for the year and set some goals around that. Like we've done that a few times with our kids. They've done that really well. Like that's fabulous. There are 2 things that we've done. One is I work really hard at owning my mistakes as a parent and as a partner, right? So like I honestly think just saying like, hey, I hear you and I'm sorry, and then not attaching anything to it, like not I'm sorry, but if you wouldn't have done this, it wouldn't have, like, nope, just say I'm sorry without attachment, put your tail between your legs and just, I'm sorry, I screwed up. And then just sit in the silence and be okay with that. Like, that's really awkward. It's really hard. It's a hard thing to do, but it's really powerful. It's a really powerful connector. So that, and I think too, just the observation piece, I think is really important, right? Like trying to remove judgment as much as I can in my family. Mm-hmm. So I can, it's easy to kind of get on each other's nerves of like, oh, you didn't put the dishes in the dishwasher right. What's wrong with you? Like we can get mad about little things that are really inconsequential. But to just be able to say like, hey, I'm noticing that this is going on. Like you seem more upset. Can you just like, what's going on? Like, just help me see where you're at and what can I do to be helpful? And doing that with your kids, doing that with your spouse, whatever that, grandparents, guardians, kind of whatever your environment is. I think that like, hey, I'm noticing ... what's going on? and then a curious, open question to just, hey, you can kind of take me wherever you need to go. I think as a communication tool, it's a really powerful connector.
And I think that's cool. Like, you're noticing, you're not saying you're doing X, Y, and Z.
Exactly. Yep.
You're bringing an invitation for a notice, and you're bringing awareness. And because what I found is a lot of times is that sometimes we can be so caught up in what we do that we're not aware. Yeah. And the reverse of it is we know our family members' trigger points. We can stab the knives and turn them extremely quickly if we want to go there. Yeah. And so for me, it's finding ways to have those awkward conversations to say, hey, I noticed you did bring up that stab mark. Like, you knew how to turn that and you used it. Why did you feel the necessity to do that? So I think that's awesome too. And the ability, what I love about like the work that you do too, is that it's nimble. And I feel like any leadership training should be nimble. It should be able to, because if you can't be a leader at your home, it's going to be difficult to be a leader at work, in my opinion. And like any new entrepreneur, I always say, start with your home. Like, start, you want to have that in order.
Yeah, it's true.
So my question for you is, people are apologizing for making it awkward. What would you say to them and invite them for future to stop it?
Yeah. I stopped apologizing for it when I started really realizing, like, well, what's it for? Like, how is it actually serving the people that I'm talking to by like bringing up the awkward stuff? And it's like, sure, it's awkward, but man, is it better on the back end, right? So it's like, I don't have to apologize for putting you in a difficult situation because I know that it's going to lead to resolve, or I know it's going to get you closer to it. Like, I know that we're going to move to something better. So I don't want to apologize for making something better, right? So like, I don't want to feel guilty about that. Does it happen every time? No. Sometimes it's just awkward, and I'm like, sorry, like genuinely, like that was bad. I apologize. But I don't feel like you have to, I'm not sorry for making it awkward, and like I don't think you have to feel that way if really what you're shooting for, and you do it in a thoughtful, considerate, caring way of like, no, I'm doing this because I care about you, and you're asking me to make it awkward without actually asking me to do it. Mm-hmm. Right? I think there's a story behind the story that takes place all the time, and it's like oftentimes people are just like, I really want you to tell me that I'm doing something wrong, or like I shouldn't be dating this person, or I shouldn't have filled out the form that way, and you're not telling me. Mm-hmm. It's like people can handle more than we think they can handle. And in some ways, it's like that bold truth sometimes, or that bold, like, hey, I'm noticing this, what's going on? It's like they just want somebody to notice them. Like, mm-hmm. That's the service that you're providing. It's like, hey, I want you to see me. Nobody's seeing me right now. People are letting me get away with mediocre work, and nobody's saying anything. Like, I just want you to see me. And so it's like that. I don't think you have to apologize for seeing someone and inviting them into a conversation. And it may not go well, but more likely than not, you're going to provide a service to that person that they're craving.
I love it. I love it so much because I don't know why it just popped up to me while you were talking, but it makes me think of in middle school, we would do things like awkward turtle or like awkward dogfish, or like
middle school is the most awkward time in the world.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, but people would always bring awareness to it in middle school. Because like you said, we're already as awkward as it can be, but it's open, and some of it's a joking way, but bringing back the awareness of when those awkward conversations and lean into them instead of running away from them. So I appreciate you. Such a great and dynamic conversation. And for anybody that wants to reach out to you afterwards, if you can tell them where to find you.
Yeah, you can find me. You can either go to www.evolve-consulting.com. That's the website. You can find me there. Or you can just directly email me if that's something you want to do, Dave@theevolvedifference.com. I don't do a whole lot on social media. I'm a little difficult to find there, but you can track me down on LinkedIn. If you type in Dave Newell, Evolve Consulting or Evolve Leadership Consulting, you'll likely find me there. Those are good ways to connect with me, and now I'm aware that I need to do more social media.
Love it. Love
Yeah.
it.
Well, this is great, Emily. You asked great questions. Thanks for the engagement, and I appreciate your insights as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody that listened in and that will listen later. Y'all all have an amazing and blessed day.